This video is brought to you by PPLIR Europe, a not-for-profit community of European general aviation pilots dedicated to helping ourselves and others to use our licenses to the full. We share our passion for flying through mutual exchange of expertise, experience, information, inspiration, and education. We also assist regulators in framing legislation that affects all GA pilots. We're almost all volunteers and do it because we love it, though we do also need to raise a little money, mainly to fund our representation and lobby activities. Please join us, improve and broaden your own flying, enjoy belonging to a community of like-minded pilots, and help us represent you. Hi, this video is about autopilots in GA aircraft. It's based on the written advisory we've published on our website with, as Alice would have said, some pictures and conversations. We'll try to gradually turn our written advisories into videos over the coming months, but in the meantime, they're all available in written form by clicking on Using the Rating from the front page of the website. As with all my videos, I'm only really considering aircraft in the Cessna 172 to Chieftain range. Autopilots are one of the greatest tools for safety and convenience in our aircraft. They can make the difference between an easy flight and arriving completely exhausted. Especially in single pilot IFR IMC operations, they can markedly enhance safety when under high workload. This is especially true in an emergency, where the pilot can be relieved of the task of handling the aircraft and can focus on managing the situation. There's also a safety advantage of using a coupled autopilot certified for approaches, in that the pilot can give greater attention to acquiring visual reference as decision altitude approaches. There are many different models available to fit in light GA aircraft, and together with other avionics, the variations in usage are huge. I'll make no attempt to tell you how to use your autopilot in detail. Whatever type of autopilot you have, you should understand all of its modes, how it transitions between them, under what circumstances it will disable itself, and how to disengage it yourself in an emergency. Few things are worse than the panic feeling when the autopilot surprises you. At the end of this video, I'll offer a checklist which can be used to document your particular autopilot, which is also in the description below. Running through something like this can be very useful on a new type, or even just a different installation of the same type. There are quite a few different types of autopilots. All autopilots take inputs from gyroscopic instruments and move the flight controls, and all modern autopilots use electronics to do some calculations in between. That's pretty much all that different autopilots have in common. Autopilots can firstly be distinguished by the type of roll input they take. Attitude-based autopilots take an input of roll and pitch. Because there's very little lag in determining pitch angle, they tend to be more stable. Rate-based autopilots take an input of rate of turn instead of roll angle. Most rate-based autopilots have an internal source of direct pitch information. Using rate of turn allows a consistent turn to be performed without needing to know speed. Also, having an autopilot which is independent of the pilot's primary attitude reference can be a lifesaver if the attitude indicator or suction pump fails. Another distinguishing factor is the number of axes controlled. Single axis, roll control only. Dual axis, roll and pitch control. 3-axis, roll, pitch, and yaw control. Yaw control is normally called yaw damping and can be engaged without other autopilot modes. It helps reduce motion sickness in passengers and, when hand flying, reduces pilot workload. On some aircraft, it's strongly recommended or required, particularly at high altitude. Although it does not interfere with normal use of rudder, it is, I think invariably, though I'm not sure, switched on only after takeoff, as it could interfere with recognition of an engine or control failure, and switched off before landing because it could interfere with a crosswind landing. And the third main grouping of autopilots is whether the electronics internally in the autopilot are analog or digital. I think that all autopilots being designed today are digital, but older analog models are still in widespread use and are still for sale. In theory, digital autopilots are more reliable and cheaper to develop, but many analog autopilots are excellent and are often easier to understand. and the only issue for the older ones can be sourcing competent maintenance. Anyone seeking maintenance should ask on the PPLIR forum, where plenty of advice can be found. Some autopilots take in some form of air data, one or more of airspeed, altitude, and vertical speed. This is used for additional modes such as airspeed hold in the climb or vertical speed in the descent. Most autopilots use a servo motor attached to the control linkages to move the controls, but some, such as the TrueTrack Echo, use small motorized trim tabs. Trim tab-based autopilots can be cheaper and lighter because the motors need to exert less force, but the results are a little sloppy, as we know from trying to hand fly using only trim. Many autopilots have automatic pitch trim control, which trims out forces on the servos. This can be a great workload reliever, but carries the additional risk of trim runaway, whereby the servo keeps running, applying greater and greater forces, which can eventually overwhelm the ability of the pilot to control the aircraft. On installations in our kind of aircraft, auto trim is only found in pitch. Some autopilots incorporate a flight director. This gives you an attitude target on your AI to follow even when the autopilot servos are disengaged. On many aircraft, it is standard practice to always fly with the flight director set up. Apart from making your hand flying more accurate and easier, this also means that you can always engage the autopilot and it will be in a useful mode immediately. Obviously, if you use it in VMC, particularly under VFR, you must make sure that you don't focus too much attention on it to the detriment of lookout. Let's talk about different operating modes. Nowadays, autopilots can have a huge variety of operating modes. It's worth understanding which modes your autopilot supports and how to engage and disengage them. The following terminology is typically used in GA autopilots. It's common to refer to raw and coupled modes. The raw mode maintains an attitude in either pitch or roll. Coupled modes slave the raw mode to a specific performance input and use pitch or roll to produce a performance output to maintain a set parameter. The coupled modes vary with the sophistication of the autopilot. Coupled inputs can be indicated airspeed, vertical speed, heading, track, radial, approach, LNAV path, GPSS, VNAV path. Each has limitations which must be understood when they're used. Wings level, the most basic mode offered by even the simplest single-axis autopilots. It keeps the wings level or zero rate of turn. Such autopilots are often referred to as wing levelers, and even this very basic functionality relieves the pilot of a good deal of workload. In an ideal world, keeping the wings level would result in flying in a straight line, but in the real world, they eventually do tend to drift off heading. Roll mode adds the ability to put the aircraft into a steady turn. Most, but not all wing levelers also have a roll mode. This is used to adjust heading to remain on track and to turn to the next desired track. Usually in roll mode, the angle of bank or rate of turn is controllable through a wide range. Although some autopilots have roll mode as well as heading mode, many do not, and roll mode is replaced by heading mode. Heading mode turns onto and follows a heading defined by a bug on the DI or HSI. Normally, once the heading mode is engaged, the autopilot will turn at a fixed angle of bank, or on a rate-based autopilot at a rate 1 turn. The angle of bank will have been set up to approximate a rate 1 turn. As I explained in my basic instrument flying video, the angle of bank required for a rate 1 turn varies with airspeed, being about 16 degrees at 90 knots and 25 degrees at 180 knots. And the configuration should take that into account for the aircraft where the autopilot is installed. But typically, in light aircraft, it will just be set to 20 degrees. Nav mode tracks a navigation course. In many, though not all installations, when the desired track is set on the OBS or HSI, it will revert initially to heading mode to turn onto the desired track, then adjust using nav mode. This is important as aircraft in pure nav mode without this feature treat every turn as a flyover and not start the turn onto the new track until the HSI is signaling a track error with respect to the new track. Most turns in the PBM world are flyby, not flyover, requiring the turn to be started some seconds before the waypoint, so the autopilot will not make the turn correctly. Such autopilots must be placed in heading mode prior to the turn, and the new heading set at the appropriate point indicated by the navigator. Track mode follows a defined ground track, usually using direct GNSS input as opposed to the flight plan track. So it's similar to heading, but it counts for drift. GPS steering, GPSS, also called roll steering, follows a GNSS track using rate of turn information from the GNSS to maintain the center line and anticipate turns extremely accurately with wind drift correction. In older autopilots, which don't have their own GPSS function, you put the autopilot in heading mode, but press a GPSS button either on the panel or on the PFD. And the heading input will be drawn not from the heading bug, but from the GPSS output. Thus, the autopilot will track whatever heading the GNSS unit is calling for. In newer autopilots, GPSS is normally selected either manually or automatically by pressing the nav button, sometimes by pressing it twice. Pitch hold holds a defined pitch angle. This is normally infinitely variable. If power and configuration are kept constant, it will normally hold indicated airspeed and rate of climb or descent for a time, but the pilot must make regular checks as it will creep off with changes in altitude. Altitude hold holds a defined altitude by varying pitch. Some autopilots have an altitude hold without a pitch mode, meaning that the pilot must manually control the aircraft onto a desired altitude and press a button to hold it there. But it's more common for the altitude hold either to be selected automatically when the pitch control is centralized or on a button press, which disengages pitch mode and maintains altitude. On some autopilot installations, the desired altitude can be pre-selected in the climb or descent, and the aircraft will level off smoothly at that altitude. This might be done on the autopilot panel itself, on an altitude selector on the panel, or on the PFD. Indicated airspeed mode holds an airspeed by varying pitch. Some autopilots call this flight level change, or FLC. Many consider this the safest way to climb, as it can never stall the aircraft, as it will pitch to maintain airspeed at the expense of vertical speed. This is particularly important for normally aspirated piston engines, which lose power as altitude increases. Vertical speed holds a defined vertical speed by varying pitch. This is the normal mode to use in descent, as we do not want excessive descent to protect passengers' eardrums, but can be hazardous in climb, as it can drive the aircraft into stall and spin as the engine power reduces with increasing altitude, to the point where airspeed is reduced dangerously. Approach mode horizontally intercepts and follows a navigation course with a high degree of sensitivity. In many instances, this is best achieved by setting the mode on an intercept heading shortly before intercepting the final approach. Some autopilots only track laterally, like a nav mode but more sensitive, but in most autopilots with an approach mode, there's also a vertical mode, waiting until glide slope or glide path intercept and following it down. Some autopilots will only arm the glide slope or glide path if the aircraft has been on the center line and below the glide slope glide path for a period of time, typically 20 seconds, which equates roughly to 2/3 of a mile, and often only if the altitude mode is engaged. Others have a method to intercept the glide path at any time, even from above. On 2D approaches and in autopilots with no glide slope or glide path capability, the horizontal profile only will be followed. So the vertical profile must be managed manually or using vertical speed or pitch mode. Back course, often marked REV for reverse, for flying back course localizer approaches. These are now so rare that I'll only mention them in passing. Envelope protection. Some modern autopilots will limit speed by pitching up and down and refuse to fly into a stall or pass VNE. Similar limits can also be applied to bank angles. Recently, systems with full-time stability protection have become available. These will apply a force to the controls to resist an unusual attitude, even when the pilot is hand flying. At least one implementation will engage the autopilot in level mode if the pilot doesn't correct things after a few seconds. Control wheel steering. While the CWS button is pressed, the autopilot will be disconnected, and when the button is released, it will re-engage to hold the pitch at which the button was released. Some autopilots will engage wings level horizontally, and some will try to follow the bank or rate of turn when the button was released. Sync. In flight director mode, pressing the sync button will align the flight director with the current aircraft attitude. This is particularly useful when the pilot has established a climb or descent. Level, not really a mode in itself, but many modern autopilots have a button which will automatically engage wings level and altitude hold. Takeoff go-around, or toga, again not really a mode in itself, but on many autopilots this will engage wings level, or nav mode horizontally, and pitch to a pre-programmed attitude, typically around 8 to 10 degrees vertically. The toga button is normally on the throttle or power lever, as the pilot is required to manually add power as required. So normally presses toga as the throttle or throttles are advanced. Toga is usually engaged at the threshold before power is applied, but it's important to note that it must not be used for rotation pitch, only as an attitude to be adopted after takeoff. Armed. Many interfaces, especially glass cockpits, will enunciate to the pilot that a mode is armed. This is usually done by colour, often green and white, but also by depiction. Pilots need to understand the enunciations in the combination they're flying. So, to summarise, different autopilots will be in different modes for different phases of flight. I'll give an example of a reasonably capable autopilot. If you use it for the initial climb, it may well be in toga. Many pilots will be hand flying but following the flight director at this stage, though if the autopilot is cleared for use at low level, it could be engaged. In the climb to cruising altitude, if you're flying vectors, you'll be in heading mode. But if you're on your flight plan, you'll be in GPSS mode. You're likely to set indicated airspeed mode to prevent stalling, with your cleared altitude or level pre-selected so that the autopilot will level off there. You would also set your damper if you have it. If you have altitude select, then the autopilot will go into altitude hold at the top of climb. And by now, you're probably no longer on vectors, so GPSS is engaged and we fly the magenta line. To start the descent, we set the cleared altitude and engage vertical speed mode. The vertical speed is going to depend on when we need to be level, but we are aiming for 500 feet a minute in unpressurized aircraft and maybe 1500 feet per minute in a pressurized one. We may need to adjust power so we do not go too fast, also bearing in mind turbulence. We probably start our descent on GPSS following an arrival or direct, but at some point we'll probably be on vectors and therefore in heading mode. Once we reach our cleared level or altitude, altitude mode will engage. In reality, we may well get a step descent, in which case we have to swap between vertical speed and altitude. This is one good argument for trying to manage the descent so that we get our next descent for clearance before we level off. If we're flying a procedure, such as an RMP approach, we'll be in GPSS mode, but if it's radar vectors to the ILS, we'll be in heading mode. Shortly before intercepting the final approach, you engage approach mode. It puts you on the localizer or final approach track, flies you down the glide path, and you're there. You disengage your damper before landing. If you go around, it's back to toga, and the sequence starts again. Obviously, if you don't have such a sophisticated autopilot, you make do with what you've got. So you might have to use pitch mode up and down, and just carefully monitor airspeed and rate of descent. You may be limited to heading mode and steer the magenta line using that. It's horses for courses. Annoyingly, the interfaces of different autopilots have just enough in common to catch you out, but not enough in common to be able to jump in and transfer from one to another. Because of the risk of trim or autopilot runaway, which can very rapidly make the aircraft uncontrollable, the most important thing to know about your autopilot and auto trim if you have it is how to disconnect it. Most autopilots and electric trim can be disconnected in a number of ways. A disconnect button on the control yoke or stick, moving the electric trim switch on the yoke or stick, a button or switch on the panel mounted unit, a separate switch on the panel, pulling a circuit breaker, if all else fails, cutting power entirely with the master switch. Electric trim runaway can happen both when the autopilot is engaged and when it's disengaged. Make sure you know how to stop it. Pulling a circuit breaker, a switch on the panel, and again, if all else fails, cutting power entirely with the master switch. As I said before, Autopilot and trim runaways can happen very fast and can be very dangerous, so the actions to disconnect and recover must be memory items and regularly practiced. It's worth highlighting the circuit breakers for your autopilot. You can get hold of small collars for this, or just use nail varnish. If the time ever comes, you don't want to be hunting for the right circuit breaker. If the circuit breaker can't be pulled, you might want to replace it with one that can be. All autopilots have pre-flight checks, which must be completed. Some will refuse to engage in flight if this hasn't been done, but many will run just fine. Just about every model of autopilot does something different when you engage it. Some will go into wings level, some into track hold, some will go into pitch hold, and others will have no vertical mode at all. Some autopilots always control pitch and roll, some can be used in roll independent of pitch. In the vast majority of setups, pitch modes cannot be used without roll. Some modes can be armed before they're active. This is almost ubiquitous with nav and approach mode, where it is armed well before you reach the final approach track and activates itself to perform the intercept. Some autopilots will default to a 30 or 45-degree intercept to a nav or approach course unless it's overridden. Many autopilots will refuse to activate nav or approach if you're crossing the course too fast. Don't fly an ILS intercept at 190 knots or on a 60-degree intercept. Your autopilot may ignore it and stay in the heading mode. Different autopilots have different limitations. It's quite common for a minimum height above the ground to be specified, which may be different for climb out and descent. And many also have speed limitations, which are well inside the aircraft's normal envelope. A very common limitation is not to be used A, as flap is deployed, or B, with flap, the latter being universally ignored as it renders it unusable for a stable approach. Many aircraft exhibit a strong pitch-up moment when flap is deployed, requiring a big trim correction by the autopilot, which may cause the autopilot to disconnect. More gradual deployment of flap prevents that problem. Now, let's talk about equipment failure modes. First and foremost, an autopilot can never be better than its inputs. If the attitude source fails, the autopilot will fail too. The same goes for heading references and navigation sources. These input failures can be most insidious. On many setups, it's possible for an attitude source to fail gradually, resulting in the autopilot taking on an ever-increasing lean, or, worst case, gradually pitching up and stalling the aircraft. Autopilots themselves have a few failure modes. The servos can fail both on and off. In the worst case, they might try to drive the controls to their limits at high speed. The servo clutches can fail on or off. If they fail on, you'll need to overpower them flying manually. Anecdotally, the most common failure is in altitude hold. The two most common reasons being slack in the cables and water in the static lines. Autopilot computers tend to be quite reliable, but when they fail, it can be spectacular, especially on older analog autopilots. If one parameter is off, the autopilot can become divergent, driving the aircraft in ever wilder oscillations. A more common failure is a refusal to pass the power on test or to refuse to engage in some modes. It also goes without saying that if you disconnect the autopilot because it's malfunctioned, you shouldn't attempt to re-engage it. Now, pilot errors. There's plenty of scope for pilots to make mistakes with autopilots. Perhaps the most common is not being conscious of what mode it's in and being surprised when it does or doesn't do something. As a general practice, you should always be conscious which horizontal and vertical modes your autopilot is in and what modes are armed. Most pilots are aware that their autopilots can stall the aircraft, but it's worth repeating, if left climbing too long in vertical speed or pitch modes, most autopilots will eventually stall the aircraft. The reverse is also true. If left ascending in vertical speed or pitch mode without adjusting power, many pilots will eventually overspeed the aircraft. As I said before, some autopilots can be quite sensitive about capturing the glide slope on an approach. They may need a few seconds stable on the localizer or to catch the localizer at least one dot below the glide slope. There's often a way to force glide slope capture, but using it can result in a violent pitch-down maneuver, so it must only be used with caution and if you're relatively close to the glide path. On installations without auto-slowing HSIs or GPSS, the pilot can be caught out when they forget to change the course pointer or heading bug approaching a waypoint. When flying a GNSS flight plan, The best time to change the course is normally when the GNSS says start turn. Finally, before we go through how to brief a new autopilot, we should have an SOP on how to engage the autopilot. You need to be very careful that you have correctly set up the autopilot or mode change before engagement. This SOP will be different for different installations and to suit individual style. But an example of a sensible procedure is, if the autopilot is not yet engaged, check the desired mode is set, that its data sorters make sense. For example, set heading mode, then check the heading bug before engaging. If you're going to use GPSS, make sure the magenta line is as expected. If you need to engage heading mode for GPSS, then check the GPSS is on and put the heading bug in roughly the right direction just in case. If you have flight director, put it on first and check the command bars lie under the aircraft symbol. If the autopilot has a pitch and/or trim doll's eye, make sure they are centered before engaging. You can try saying aloud what you want the autopilot to achieve, e.g. arm altitude capture for 4,000 feet. Touch the button and make sure it's the correct one, saying altitude arm. Then push the button. Close the loop by reading the enunciation, 4,000 feet alt armed. Often in glass cockpits, such as the G1000, white is armed, green is engaged, but that can't be relied on in all installations. On many self-contained autopilot delays, it's monochrome but uses the word arm or armed. Working slowly through this is better than rushing. There should never be a reason to have to engage the autopilot quickly, except possibly in the case of the level button, which is still a relative rarity. As I've been saying throughout this video, all autopilots are different, sometimes very significantly so. If you're going to fly an aircraft with an autopilot that's new to you, make sure that you are briefed on it before you go. I'll end up with the kind of things that you would be making sure you understand. I've put this checklist in the comments, and it's also in the advisory on the website. What model of autopilot is it? Are there instructions in the POH? What methods exist to disconnect it? Where is the circuit breaker? Is it highlighted? Does it have electric trim? What methods exist to disconnect it? Where is the breaker? Is it highlighted? What is the primary input source, attitude or rate of turn? What are its failure modes? How can it be monitored? Under what circumstances will the autopilot disengage itself? What pre-flight checks are required? What limitations does the autopilot have? Minimum height, speed envelope, icing? Does it have control wheel steering? What happens if you press the control wheel steering when the autopilot is off? What modes will CWS place the autopilot into after use? If the aircraft is in an unusual attitude when CWS is released, what will the autopilot do? Does it have flight director? How do you engage it? How do you disengage it? How do you go from flight director to full autopilot and back again? Does it have any kind of envelope protection? Does it protect against pitch angles or airspeed excursions or both? Is that protection active when the autopilot is off? Can that protection be overwritten? Does it have yaw damper? What are its limitations? Are there any circumstances when it's required, recommended, or prohibited? How can the autopilot be engaged? What mode will it be after being engaged? Does it have a level button? If not, how do you quickly enable wings level and altitude hold modes? What modes does it have? Can horizontal modes be engaged independently of vertical ones? Are approach and nav mode armed or entered directly? How do you maintain current heading while intercepting the nav or approach course? Does approach mode glide slope capture require a certain amount of time with the localizer captured? If you're new to the aircraft or autopilot, take your time getting to know the autopilot thoroughly. Until you've built up experience and confidence, be prepared for the unexpected. In critical situations, e.g. leveling off in controlled airspace or intercepting a final approach course in IMC, be ready with a plan B, which might well be to disconnect the autopilot and fly manually. You can think about what went wrong later on the ground. That's the end of a very quick roundup and run through. If you have any questions, please join PPLIR Europe, if you're not already a member, and ask on the forum. See you in the next video.